The sun had barely risen when Arav opened the rusty latch of his narrow door and stepped into the muddy lane outside. His breath lingered in the morning air, not because it was cold, but because the air was thick with tiredness, the kind that comes from carrying too many burdens for too long. He rubbed his eyes, slung his worn-out bag over his thin shoulder, and quietly tiptoed past his mother's bed. She was still asleep, her breathing shallow, her frail body wrapped in a thin shawl. Next to her, Arav's little sister Mina clutched a school book in her arms even in sleep. Their tiny home, patched together with wood, plastic, and hope, was barely big enough to lie down in, let alone dream big dreams. But Arav never complained. At 19, his dreams were simple: to keep his mother alive, to help Mina study, and to someday sleep without worry. He worked as a waiter at a roadside cafe in the city, a place where rich businessmen came to sip coffee and scroll through their phones, barely noticing the boy who filled their cups or wiped their crumbs. Arav walked there every day, 2 miles each way, because bus fare was a luxury he couldn't afford. His shoes had holes, his shirt had a faded collar, and his hands were calloused from carrying trays, but his eyes were kind, and his heart was honest. That particular morning, as he walked through puddles and past honking rickshaws, he didn't know his life was about to take a turn that would test everything he believed in. The cafe buzzed with its usual chaos. Plates clanged, orders were yelled, and steam rose from the open kitchen. Arav moved quickly between tables, smiling at customers who barely looked up. It was near closing time, almost past 11 p.m., when a sleek black car pulled up outside. The man who stepped out was tall, sharply dressed, and carried an aura that made people shift. He entered the cafe, followed by the soft jingle of the bell, and sat at the corner booth, scrolling through his phone with a scowl on his face. Arav approached him with his usual gentle tone. "Good evening, sir. May I take your order?" The man didn't look up. "Black coffee, make it fast." Arav nodded and walked away without flinching. He'd served customers like him before, rich, impatient, and blind to those below them. But he still made the coffee with care, placed it on the tray, and walked it over, setting it gently on the table. The man barely nodded, took a few sips, answered some phone calls, and after 20 minutes left in a hurry, dropping a few bills on the table. Arav sighed, cleaned the cup, wiped the table, and as he bent to adjust the seat, he noticed something tucked between the cushion and the wood. A wallet. It was thick, elegant, and heavy. Arav opened it slowly. Inside, he saw crisp currency, notes, at least 50,000 rupees, along with a sleek black credit card, a few receipts, and a business card that read, Mr. Karan Mehra, Director, Mehra Group of Industries. Arav's hands trembled slightly. Not because he was afraid, but because for a moment a tiny thought crept in. What if he kept it? 50,000 rupees could mean medicines for Amma, a full year's tuition for Mina, maybe even a new pair of shoes. No one had seen the wallet. Mr. Mehra was already gone. It would be so easy, so easy. But then he looked at the name again, and he remembered his father's voice, a whisper from the past, from the time before life became so hard. Beta, never take what's not yours. Even if you're starving, your honesty is your true wealth. Arav sighed, closed the wallet, and slipped the business card into his pocket. He handed the wallet to the cafe owner, but the man shrugged, saying, "Leave it. These rich people never come back. You want it? Take it." But Arav didn't. He couldn't. He just nodded and asked if he could take the next morning off. The cafe owner laughed. "Sure, as if anyone's going to reward you for being stupidly honest." The next morning, Arav dressed in his best shirt, which still had a small tear at the sleeve, and left early. He didn't take the bus. He couldn't. He walked all the way to the tall building whose address was on the card. Glass walls, security guards in uniform, and people in suits who walked fast, talked fast, and didn't smile. Arav stood at the gate for 5 minutes, rehearsing what he would say. Finally, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. The security guard looked at him suspiciously. "Delivery?" "No, sir. I found this wallet. It belongs to Mr. Karan Mehra. I came to return it. The guard narrowed his eyes. Wait, here. Arav waited, clutching the wallet like it was made of glass. Minutes passed. People passed. Some stared. Some scoffed. One woman even whispered, "Another scammer, probably." Finally, a tall man in a blazer walked down the marble steps. It was him, Karan Mehra. His eyes fell on Arav and the wallet. He walked up and took it from his hand without a word. He opened it, checked inside quickly, and then looked at Arav. "You didn't touch anything?" Arav shook his head. "No, sir. I found it on your table last night. I thought I should return it personally." Karan raised an eyebrow. "And what do you want in return?" Arav blinked. "Nothing, sir." A short laugh escaped Karan's lips. "Right. You people always say that. Hoping for some publicity, maybe? A reward? A job offer?" Arav's face flushed, not in anger, but in quiet shame. Not because he'd done something wrong, but because his honesty was being weighed against the assumption of greed. "I'm sorry you think that," Arav said softly. "I didn't come for anything. I just didn't want to keep something that wasn't mine." He turned to leave, but something inside him couldn't leave without saying it. Not to prove a point, but just to speak the truth one last time. "My mother is sick, sir. My sister studies by candlelight. We barely eat 2 meals a day. But I still returned your wallet. Not because I wanted anything from you, but because that's how I was raised." With that, he walked away, back through the revolving doors, out into the noisy street, the weight of insult heavier than any wallet could ever be. Karan Mehra stood still, the wallet now lighter in his hand. Something clutched his chest. It wasn't guilt yet, but it was close. He opened the wallet again, flipping through the cards, when a small slip of paper fell out. A note. In careful handwriting it read, "Sir, I didn't take anything. I'm just returning what is yours. Life is hard, but I believe doing the right thing is always right, no matter how poor you are. Arav." And just like that, something in Karan shifted. A memory surfaced, a dusty room, a hungry night, a kind hand once offered to him when he was just a boy selling tea at a railway station. He had promised himself back then, if he ever made it, he'd never forget where he came from, but he had. He'd forgotten. Now, because of one boy, one stranger with nothing in his pocket but truth, he was remembering again. But by the time he looked up, Arav was gone. Swallowed by the crowd. Just like that. Back in the slum, Arav sat beside his mother's bed, wiping her forehead with a wet cloth. Mina returned from school with a big smile, showing her brother a drawing she made of him. It was a stick figure with a tray and a giant heart. "Paya," she giggled. "You're my hero." Arav smiled, but behind his eyes was a tiredness that no sleep could cure. He hadn't saved the day. He hadn't fixed their lives. But he had done something else, something bigger. He had stood by his values, even when it hurt. And somewhere, not too far away, a man in a glass tower stared at the same note for the 10th time, no longer able to shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, the boy who returned his wallet had given him something far more valuable than what was inside. Karan Mehra sat alone in his office long after everyone had left. The city lights flickered through the glass walls behind him, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. The wallet was still in front of him, untouched, and the small note with Arav's careful handwriting lay beside it like a silent whisper he couldn't unhear. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. Images from the past rushed in without warning. A skinny boy with dust-covered feet running between train compartments, carrying a tin kettle and yelling, "Chai! Chai garam!" That was him once. That was Karan. Long before suits and skyscrapers, before drivers and meetings, he had known what hunger tasted like. He had known what it meant to go unnoticed. He had forgotten it over the years, or maybe he had buried it somewhere deep, beneath his ambition and polished shoes, But Arav had dug it up with nothing more than a simple act of honesty. He couldn't sleep that night, not because he was angry or because he'd lost something. In fact, he hadn't lost anything at all. But still, something inside him ached. For the first time in years, Karan questioned the man he had become. Not the successful one, the human one. The next morning, Arav woke up early as usual. He had a shift at the cafe, and despite the emotional storm inside him from the day before, he knew life didn't stop. Rent had to be paid. His mother needed her medicine. Mina needed pencils and notebooks. He stepped quietly outside, his footsteps light, but his heart heavy. He hadn't told his mother what happened. He didn't want her to worry. She already blamed herself too much for their struggles. The cafe was busy that day. A tourist group had arrived, and the owner barked out orders like a drill sergeant. Arav kept his head down and his hands moving, juggling plates, glasses, and trays. He smiled at customers even when his feet ached. That was who he was. No matter what happened, he chose to stay kind. Around noon, a sleek black car pulled up again. The same one. The door opened, and Mr. Karanmera stepped out, dressed in a crisp blue shirt, his face unreadable. The cafe owner rushed over, all smiles and flattery. "Welcome back, sir. What can we get for you today?" Karan ignored him. His eyes scanned the cafe until they landed on Arav, who stood frozen near the kitchen counter, a tray in his hands and confusion in his eyes. Karan walked straight toward him. The cafe went quiet, like someone had turned down the volume on the world. Arav set the tray down slowly. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, his voice calm but cautious. Karan didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the wallet, the same one, and placed it on the counter between them. "I came to return this," he said. Arav blinked. "But it was yours." Karan nodded. "Yes, but what you returned to me was more than money. You gave me back something I lost a long time ago." Arav said nothing. The cafe owner watched nervously, not sure what was going on. Karan took a deep breath. "I was once like you, poor, invisible. I know what it feels like to wonder if the next meal will come. But somewhere along the way I forgot all that. I became someone I don't even recognize anymore." He paused, looking around the cafe. "And then I met you. A boy who had nothing, and still chose honesty over hunger. You reminded me of who I used to be." Arav's eyes dropped to the floor. He didn't know what to say. Karan reached into his pocket again and pulled out a white envelope. He placed it next to the wallet. "This is for your mother's treatment," he said softly, "and for your sister's education. And for you, to not have to walk miles every day just to serve people who don't even see you." Arav's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The cafe owner's eyes widened when he saw the bundle of cash inside the envelope. It wasn't just a small tip, it was life-changing. But Karan wasn't done. "I also spoke to my HR department. This morning," he continued, "we have a vacancy in our logistics team, entry level. The job comes with training, and if you're willing to learn, I think you'd do well. You won't have to carry trays anymore." Now the cafe owner stepped in, trying to salvage his pride. "Sir, Arav is a good boy, very hard-working. We're lucky to have him here." Karan looked at Arav, then back at the cafe owner. "I think he's meant for more than waiting tables." He turned to leave, then paused. "Think about it. My office will be waiting for your call." And just like that, he was gone again. The silence in the cafe was deafening. Customers had stopped eating. Staff had stopped moving. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it. Arav stood still for a long time, staring at the envelope. His hands trembled as he picked it up. He opened it slowly and counted the notes inside. 50,000 rupees. The exact amount that was in the wallet. The cafe owner clapped him on the back. "Well, looks like you hit the jackpot, huh?" But Arav didn't smile, because it didn't feel like a jackpot. It felt like a message, a reminder that doing the right thing might not always bring instant rewards, but it does come back, around in ways you don't expect. That evening, Arav went home early. He handed the envelope to his mother, who stared at it with disbelief. Tears filled her eyes, and she covered her face, whispering prayers under her breath. Mina jumped up and down with excitement, asking if they could finally buy storybooks and maybe even a small fan for the summer heat. Arav hugged them both tightly. He still hadn't decided about the job. It felt like too much, too soon. But a small spark had lit inside him. Hope. And that was something he hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, he stood outside the Mera Group building once again, but this time, his shoulders weren't slouched. His shirt was neatly ironed, and he carried something with him that couldn't be seen. Self-worth. The receptionist recognized him and smiled this time. "Mr. Mera is expecting you," she said warmly. Arav nodded and followed a young executive upstairs. The office was vast, polished, and quiet, but it didn't scare him now. Karan was waiting inside. He stood up as Arav entered and extended his hand. Arav hesitated for a second, then shook it. "Are you ready?" Karen asked. Arav smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't come from lips but from the soul. "I think I am, sir." They sat down and began discussing the training program. As Karan spoke, he noticed something in Arav's eyes. Not just intelligence, but gratitude, a deep, sincere gratitude that can only come from someone who has seen darkness and still chosen to walk in light. As the conversation continued, Karan felt something else too, a sense of purpose. Helping this boy wasn't charity. It was justice. It was restoring balance in a world that too often rewards greed and punishes honesty. Later that night, as Arav walked back to his home, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, he stopped by a street vendor and bought samosas for his mother and Mina. It was the first time in years he had money in his pocket that wasn't borrowed, saved, or owed. At home, the lights were on. Real lights, not candles. The electricity bill was paid that morning. Mina hugged him tightly and whispered, "Paya, does this mean things will be okay now?" Arav looked down at her and smiled. "Yes, Mina, things will be okay." But what he didn't say out loud was the truth he now knew deep within his heart. Things would be okay not because someone helped them, but because he chose to stay good even when life tried to make him otherwise, and far away in a quiet room. Karan Mera sat in front of a framed photo of his parents, a rare softness on his face. He whispered to the air, "I finally did something right today, because someone reminded me how, that someone was a poor waiter with nothing in his pocket and everything in his heart." The days that followed were nothing short of a quiet miracle for Arav. Life, which had once felt like an endless uphill climb, had begun to shift, not all at once, not with loud fireworks or grand announcements, but slowly, like the first rays of sunlight creeping into a dark room after a long storm. He was now training at the Mehra Group office, learning skills he had only read about in borrowed books or heard in passing conversations among cafe customers. Every morning, he arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in his neatly ironed second-hand shirt and borrowed shoes, with a pen and notepad tucked into his pocket like a soldier's. Sword? Karan Mera kept a watchful eye from afar, never interfering too much but always ensuring Arav had the right support. The older man had started coming to the office earlier than usual, sipping his coffee by the window as he watched the sun rise. He spoke a little more gently now, thanked his staff more often, and even smiled. Not just the polite kind for boardrooms, but real, honest smiles that reached his eyes. One day, during a lunch break, Arav sat in the cafeteria reading a business manual when a man in a formal suit approached him. "You're the new intern, right?" he asked. Arav nodded. The man smiled. "I'm Rajan, head of logistics. Heard a lot about you. Everyone's talking about the boy who returned the wallet." Arav's cheeks flushed. "It wasn't a big deal. I just did what was right." Rajan pulled out a chair and sat beside him. That's exactly why it's a big deal. That moment was more than a conversation. It was the start of something Arav had never experienced before. Being seen, truly seen, not as a background worker but as someone of value. At home, things were changing too. His mother's health had started to improve. The medication they could now afford made her stronger each day, and she had begun knitting again. Small pieces at first, then sweaters and scarves she sold in the local market. Mina, too, had a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She brought home stars on her report card, and every evening she waited eagerly to tell Arav everything she learned that day. One night, Arav came home and found a hand-drawn card on his bed. It was from Mina. The cover showed a boy holding a wallet and a heart beside him. Inside, in wobbly handwriting, she had written, "You're my hero, Bhaiya." He stared at it for a long time, his eyes blurring with tears. He wasn't used to being anyone's hero. But in that small moment, in their small room, he felt like the richest man alive. Karan, meanwhile, began reflecting more deeply on his life. For years, his world had revolved around deals, deadlines, and digits on a screen. But now he found himself thinking about legacy. Not the kind that filled balance sheets, but the kind that lived in the hearts of people. The kind that changed lives. He had lunch with his college friend Nisha one afternoon and told her everything. "So this boy reminded you of who you were," she said, stirring her coffee slowly. "Yes," Karan admitted, "and who I still want to be." Nisha smiled. "Then do more. Help more. Maybe it's time to invest in people, not just projects." That conversation lingered with him, and within a week Karan called a meeting with his board. He announced the creation of a new corporate initiative, a scholarship and mentorship program for underprivileged youth. He named it Arav Foundation. The boardroom fell into stunned silence. One executive leaned forward and asked, "Why that name?" Karan looked around and said, "Because he reminded me that honesty isn't weakness, it's strength, and we need more of that in our future leaders." Word spread quickly. Newspapers picked up the story. Social media flooded with headlines, like, "Waiter's Honesty Inspires Billionaire to Launch Foundation." People shared their own stories of kindness and integrity. Arav's story became a beacon in a world that often felt too cold. But Arav didn't let it get to his head. When a local reporter came to interview him, he simply said, "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just didn't forget who I was." Still, he couldn't deny the warmth he felt when he saw the signboard outside the Mera building, Arav Foundation, empowering the honest. The foundation opened its first center within 2 months. Arav, now working part-time while still studying under the company's mentorship, was invited to speak at the opening ceremony. He stood nervously in front of a small crowd, donors, volunteers, staff, and a few children from slums who would be the first beneficiaries of the program. He looked over at Karen, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. Arav took a deep breath. "When I found that wallet," he began, "my first thought wasn't, 'How much is inside?' It was, 'Who does this belong to?' Because I knew what it felt like to lose things. Not just money, but hope. And I didn't want anyone else to feel that way." He paused, letting the silence speak for him. "People say I changed a billionaire's heart. But the truth is, he changed mine too. He showed me that kindness doesn't have to be lonely, that sometimes, when you do the right thing, the world responds." He stepped off the stage to a standing ovation, but the loudest applause came from Mina, who stood on her chair and cheered, "That's my Bhaiya!" Backstage, Karan met him with a handshake, but then pulled him into a quick, rare hug. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you, sir," Arav replied, "for everything." Karan looked at him and said, "You're not working for me anymore, Arav. You're working with me. We're partners in this now." And, just like that, everything came full circle. Months passed. Arav began managing projects within the foundation. He traveled to villages, slums, and schools, meeting kids who reminded him of Mina, families who reminded him of his mother, and boys who reminded him of himself. He listened to their stories. He helped build computer labs, organized language classes, and even taught budgeting workshops, using simple terms, like he once wished someone had done for him. One rainy evening, he stood under a tin roof in a village classroom, soaked to the bone, teaching a dozen children how to write their names in English. As thunder rumbled in the distance and rain pounded the ground, Arav smiled. He didn't need a fancy office or big titles. He had found purpose, something that no wallet, no matter how full, could buy. At home, his mother now walked without assistance. Mina had dreams of becoming a teacher, and Arav had opened a savings account just for her future education. They had a fan, a bookshelf, a fridge, and more importantly, peace. One night, as they sat eating simple dal and rice, his mother looked up and said, "I used to worry so much about what kind of man you would grow up to be." Arav looked at her, amused. "And now?" She smiled gently. "Now I thank God every night, because you didn't just grow into a man, you grew into a light." He didn't know what to say to that, so he simply reached over and held her hand. Elsewhere, in a quiet corner of his large house, Karan Mehra sat beside a photo of his younger self. It was one he had found in an old trunk, a boy in torn slippers holding a tray of tea. He had framed it and placed it on his desk. Every time he felt himself slipping back into the cold world of profits and percentages, he looked at that photo, and then he remembered the day a poor waiter handed him a wallet and gave him back his soul. He smiled and whispered to the photo, "We turned out okay, didn't we?" And far away, a young man named Arav continued to walk the streets, not with burdened shoulders, but with quiet strength, for he carried with him a story, not of luck or wealth, but of choosing right over easy, of lighting a fire in someone else's heart simply by staying true to his own. And though the world may not always notice such souls, fate always does.